The honourable member for Guelph.
Mr. Speaker, I consider it an honour and a responsibility to speak in support of Bill C-304, an act to ensure secure, adequate, accessible and affordable housing for Canadians. Our country has so much to be proud of. Canada ranks 8th on the United Nations Development Programme's Human Development Index, but sadly, there remain many national issues completely unattended and unnoticed by this government, issues in desperate need of improvement and a meaningful commitment. We need the government to begin to respect the intent of the Veterans Charter so that the brave men and women who fight for Canada receive the reparations and services they need and deserve. To do anything less diminishes the efforts and the unlimited risks that our veterans expose themselves to on our behalf. Colonel Strogren believes that between 700 and 2,000 Canadian veterans are homeless, and this needs to change. I implore all members to vote for this legislation so that the very men and women who have defended our country do not have to sleep on its streets. Canada has, in the last 5 years, become the single biggest recipient of international fossil awards and is now known as an environmental laggard. We, and more importantly our children and grandchildren, require that the government make a meaningful commitment to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, to reconstitute programs that encourage green building and renovations, and to support renewable sources of energy for both environmental and economic benefits. When will this government understand that doing so will both create jobs and save our planet? We require that this government begin to work for lower-income Canadians who are left behind whenever the government cuts corporate taxes, like the $6 billion corporate tax cut planned for next year. And, Mr. Speaker, we need a national housing strategy, and we need that strategy to work for lower-income and marginalized Canadians now. Secure housing and early learning and childcare are fundamental to eliminating poverty, and while this government abandoned a fulsome early learning and childcare strategy deployed by the previous Liberal government, it now has the opportunity to commit to an integral part of the equation, a national housing strategy. There are gaping holes in our social safety net through which the most vulnerable Canadians are falling. It is our responsibility as decision makers to close those holes and ensure that every Canadian receives the services they require: universal health care, food security, education, and housing security. The link between these: reduced crime rates, lower social and health care costs, and higher productivity, proven time and time again in countries that deploy such strategies. We must demonstrate ourselves to be a compassionate country, committed to helping those in need for moral reasons and, frankly, for economic ones also. We have an opportunity to pass Bill C-304, which will initiate a dialogue to create a national housing strategy. This will bring Canada closer to meeting its international obligations and will help to ensure that Canadians are protected from the affliction of homelessness and the overwhelming cost of housing. A recent study on increased food bank use made the following statement, quote, the need for food banks is a result of our failure as a country to adequately address a number of social issues, including a changing job market, a lack of affordable housing and childcare, and a social safety net that is effective. It's been proven that passing this legislation will help to strategically increase the availability of adequate housing so that marginalized Canadians' health is better protected and that crime is reduced, so that federal and subnational governments' spending is focused on achieving a clear set of objectives to maximize the value of every dollar spent reducing homelessness, and to help alleviate the pressures on municipalities that are also overwhelmed by the delivery of so many publicly provided services. My time on the Wellington and Guelph Housing Authority, working with Onward Willow, and on the Guelph-Wellington Task Force for Poverty Elimination has affirmed my strong conviction that taking action to create affordable housing is, without question, one of the most effective ways to lift entire families out of poverty and into prosperity. It is with this experience and these convictions in mind that I am extremely disappointed that Canada is the only G8 country without a national strategy to ensure that its citizens have affordable and accessible housing. Housing is enshrined in the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which reads, quote, "Everyone has a right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself or herself and of his or her family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care." In 1976, Canada, as a signatory to the International Covenant on Economic, Cultural, and Social Rights, committed itself to, quote, "make progress on fully realizing all economic, social, and cultural rights, including the right to adequate housing for all citizens." Despite our clear commitment to providing housing for all Canadians, an astounding number of citizens remain either homeless or live in inadequate housing. Over 300,000 Canadians are homeless. Approximately 3.3 million live in substandard housing, and over 750,000 families live in overcrowded housing. These numbers predate the recession. A recent study completed by the Canadian Payroll Association documents that approximately 59% of Canadian employees would, quote, "have trouble making ends meet if their paycheck was delayed by only 1 week. This means that homelessness and inadequate housing could, should we experience further economic difficulties, be even more protracted, even more catastrophic than it currently is. And this is but one reason we must pass this legislation and move towards a national housing strategy, built with all stakeholders' input to incorporate Canada's regional, cultural, and economic diversity. These numbers are staggering, and the world is taking notice. On February 3, 2009, Canada was reviewed by the UN Human Rights Working Group. Given the state of housing in Canada, the working group, composed of 45 countries, actually felt compelled to make recommendations on how Canada could better meet its international obligations. In response to its recommendations, the government said the following, quote, "Canada acknowledges that there are challenges, and the Government of Canada commits to continuing to explore ways to enhance efforts to address poverty and housing issues in collaboration with provinces and territories." The intent of the government has been clearly stated. This is the perfect opportunity for them to join words with action, which they are typically so disinclined to do. Intent is not enough. It must be transformed into action. This means all of us in this House agreeing to create a national strategy and honoring the Canadian response to the Workers' Group review. It means voting in favour of this legislation to create one. Liberal Senator Eggleton and PC Senator Segal recently published a well-researched Senate report on poverty elimination titled "In from the Margins." They are clear. Fundamental to poverty elimination is the need to provide sustained and adequate funding for affordable housing through a national housing and homelessness strategy. Michael Shapcott, Director General of the Wellesley Institute, funding provider for multiple expert studies on housing and health, is clear. Canadians with homes are healthy Canadians, and healthy Canadians mean reduced health care costs. This is yet another reason why we need to pass this legislation. The Federation of Canadian Municipalities, currently on the Hill advocating for municipalities, is also clear in its support for this legislation. FCM policy advisor Joshua Bates said in committee that, quote, "Chronic homelessness and lack of affordable housing are not just social issues. They're core economic issues. They strain the limited resources of municipal governments and undermine the economic well-being of our cities, which are the engines of national economic growth, competitiveness, and productivity." The United Nations, the Wellesley Institute, FCM, the Assembly of First Nations are but some of the bodies in support of this legislation. And from past statements of intent, so too, it seems, is the Government of Canada. Remember, the government is pledged to enhance efforts to address poverty and housing issues in collaboration with provinces and territories, and we need a national housing strategy to do so effectively. It is not only imperative that we pass this legislation for compassionate reasons, to lift Canadians from poverty and to give the most vulnerable better lives, we must also introduce a national housing strategy that our housing dollars are spent in the most effective way possible. As such, I am appealing to all of you today on both compassionate and fiscally responsible grounds to pass this legislation and begin the dialogue that will bring Canada closer to having a national housing strategy, which will bring our country into compliance with our international obligations and reduce poverty and crime through addressing Canada's housing crisis. Your vote, simply put, amounts to doing the right thing. Thank you.